Welcome to Spectrum Sundays. I am Francesca D'Alessandro, a current master's student at University of Buffalo studying speech-language pathology. Additionally, I am your Miss Thousand Islands of New York State, serving my community through AAA appreciation and awareness for autism.
And I am Megan Sinisi, a Master of Health Science candidate studying to practice as a pediatric speech-language pathologist. I am also Miss Central Pennsylvania and the founder of a nonprofit organization for autism titled From a New Perspective.
Everyone deserves to feel accepted and included in every space they walk in. Our series aims to inspire you to advocate for yourself and on behalf of your loved ones. And we are so grateful that you're here with us today. Haley Moss made international headlines for becoming the first documented openly autistic attorney admitted to the Florida bar. She received her Juris Doctor from the University of Miami School of Law in 2018 and graduated from the University of Florida in 2015 with her BS in Psychology and BA in Criminology and Law. Haley is the author of Great Minds Think Differently, Neurodiversity for Lawyers and Other Professionals, to be released in June 2021 by the American Bar Association. Her next book, The Young Autistic Adults Independence Handbook, will be available in November 2021. Haley is also the author of Middle School, The Stuff No One Tells You About, and a freshman survival guide for college students with autism spectrum disorders. Haley's work on neurodiversity, autism, and disability has also been published in national media outlets. She was appointed to the Florida Bar Young Lawyers Division Board of Governors, the Florida Bar Journal Editorial Board, and the Florida Bar Standing Committee on Diversity and Inclusion. Haley also serves on the Constituency Board for the University of Miami, Nova Southeastern University Center for Autism and Related Disabilities. So we have been really excited to have you on for quite a while, and just from the introduction that we've just given to our viewers, I feel like this is the tip of the iceberg of everything that you do. So thank you for being with us today.
Absolutely. And thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I'm really excited to get to know both of you better and to get to share a little bit more.
Great. Well, on Spectrum Sundays, we always like to start our conversations by asking our guests whether they prefer person first language, which is saying person with autism, or identity first language, which is saying autistic person. So do you have a preference for one over the other? And if so, could you explain why this is important?
So this is a journey, I think, for anyone. And for me, this actually was. So especially even when you see the work that I did when I was a teenager, you probably noticed a lot of very heavy on person first and functioning labels. And honestly, the answer to that as a young teenager is simply, I didn't know better. And that's kind of how I like to explain it, is I didn't realize at the time that my initial diagnosis, which did include high functioning, was harmful. I didn't know better as someone who was 14, 15 years old. But as I've gotten older, I realized something about that never quite sat with me, because I always felt very alienated from parts of my community in the not autistic like them kind of sense. And that just wasn't true. So I will say that I'm autistic. I won't clarify with high functioning or anything like that, because it just doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help me because I realized very early on that label automatically denied me support that I needed. And people were like, oh, you were basically normal enough that you don't need support. So I realized autistic fit me better because it is such a huge part of who I am, kind of just like being a woman is or being a redhead is. It's not something that I can separate from who I am. So I can't just set my autism down in my purse and then go run around the beach if I wanted to, even though that would be pretty cool at times. But it's not like that. So I feel like it's not something I'm ever with. It's something that's always a part of me. And I'm proud of that. I don't have anything that I'm ashamed of about being autistic. So I do use identity first language. And I am not someone who gets upset if you do refer to me with person first. It's just, don't tell me that I'm wrong for using identity language. That used to happen a lot with professionals. People have gotten a lot better about that. But if I say, hi, I'm autistic, and you go, no, don't you just have autism? No, like that's where I draw the line. But if you do use person first to refer to me, I'm not going to get upset, but I do use identity first when I describe myself.
I'm glad that you took the time to say that it doesn't bother you if that mistake is made, but what you prefer, because I feel that a lot of advocates aren't sure which direction to go, because in our education for speech language pathology, we're often told to use person first to be responsible. But then we hear from self-advocates that they really want to embrace their identity of being autistic. So it's kind of hard to toe the line and see
Mhm.
what's most preference, but thank you for clarifying that. And
Absolutely. And I think something that is always helpful, especially for young professionals, is even just if you can ask a client or a friend or another self-advocate, whoever it may be, how they describe themselves. It's a very simple question. And it's usually just that nice way to get that information out. And what my thing always was, if I genuinely didn't know, I'd just say on the spectrum, because I felt like it was that neutral ground that nobody loves it, nobody hates it. So if I really don't know, or if I'm in a room full of professionals that are going to insist on person first, I will just say on the spectrum or on the autism spectrum. It's a little clunky. It feels kind of funky for me, but it usually does the job.
well, thank you for explaining that. So, to lay the groundwork for our conversation today, we want to start off by talking about neurodiversity, which kind of aligns with this identity first language. So,
Mhm.
neurodiverse is a term that can have many different meanings by the people that are involved in the movement. So, in your own words, could you describe what neurodiversity or neurodivergent means to you and what is important about advocating for this community?
So to me, neurodiversity is actually just a fact of life. So we all have different brains, and that's really cool. So our brains all work differently from one another. And what neurodiversity really goes to say is that these different brains that we have is not something that is a bad thing. It's just a natural variation, kind of like all other biodiversity, how we have like different species and things like that. And that these neurological and cognitive differences are simply to be respected and recognized and accepted. So the way that I like to describe this as well is this, that you have your neurotypical people whose brains work inside this norm, and then you have people who are neurodivergent, who have differences and other diagnoses and things that fall under this difference. So folks who might be neurodivergent are people like on the autism spectrum, people with ADHD, learning disabilities, Tourette syndrome. I also put in intellectual disabilities and mental health disabilities in there because I think a lot of our friends who do have intellectual disabilities often get thrown under the bus with disability advocacy as a whole, let alone neurodiversity. And I know a lot of folks in the mental health community, because their brains work outside of this norm as well, who do identify with neurodiversity and as neurodivergent. So I try to make sure that we realize that having different brains and different ways that we view the world and how we process things is very different, and it's a very broad tent. I think there's this huge misconception that neurodiversity is just a synonym for autism acceptance, and that's not exactly true.
Yes, and I thank you for explaining that a little bit more in depth, because I feel like people who don't understand that it covers so many different disorders, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
don't think that neurodiversity really applies to them, but it really impacts so many people out there. And the more that we can start accepting this concept of neurodiversity, and with my initiative, it's titled Appreciation and Awareness, because I feel
Mm-hmm.
like we need to have more appreciation for neurodiversity everywhere we go, whether that's in school or the workplace. And we shouldn't just be focusing on the accommodations
Mm-hmm.
that some of these individuals or students need. We should just focus also on the different perspectives that they bring to our
Mm-hmm.
community.
Absolutely. Everything should just be accessible forever, so we don't have to worry as much about how do we just accommodate people. So I think everything should, if we had that kind of baseline, it would be that a lot of this is just built in. Even when we think about how much time somebody needs on a test, if we gave everybody a larger amount of time, that would benefit the most impacted person. Some people are going to finish early and some people are going to finish right on time, that nobody's really having to go through extra hoops to get there. So I always come from can we just make everything accessible and use universal design forever when it comes to those things? But I do know and 100% appreciate the value of accommodating students and things like that too, because it's necessary. We're not there yet. We're not at this appreciation and acceptance phase yet, and we haven't taken action as a collective society to get there.
Exactly. And that's why we appreciate the work that you do with your professional career. And we want to get to know what you've been doing more with your law work and how you plan on better serving your community.
So I didn't know I wanted to be a lawyer. And I'm very honest about that because I went to college thinking I was going to be a psychiatrist and I was going to go to med school and I was going to be a doctor. And I thought it would be really cool because I don't understand people naturally. And I thought, what better way to understand people than to know how the brain works and be able to help people with their problems? That just sounded so cool to me. Enter first semester chemistry. It did not go well. I dropped it after 6 weeks. And I was back at the drawing board of what do I actually like to do? And I know that I love to write and I love to talk and I love to help other people. And it turns out that's kind of what lawyers do. At least they should. So that's how I ended up wanting to go to law school. It didn't have lawyers in my family. I didn't know really what lawyers did. Sometimes I feel like I still don't know exactly what lawyers do at times because it's such a very broad field that you have trial attorneys, you have people that are transactional, you have in-house, you have people that are just doing policy work, you have all sorts of different things going on. So it's really interesting to kind of see. And when I started my career, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was working in a firm practicing in international law and healthcare litigation. So that's a very technical way of saying that I worked on anti-terrorism cases and I also helped hospitals sue insurance companies. And it's not that I didn't feel fulfilled with that because I was so grateful for the opportunity and to get to learn. But I realized there was just so much more that I could be doing. And I felt that my calling was elsewhere. So for me, when I left my job, I realized, oh my God, there's so much more I could do. And I left actually to keep speaking and consulting because that's what I was doing on the side anyway. I was doing a lot of talking about neurodiversity at work. I was doing a lot on the Americans with Disabilities Act. I was doing this stuff anyway. And I'm like, can't I just make that my job? So hopefully we have more acceptance, understanding, compliance, and we also just have that personal perspective along with professional experience that helps bridge these gaps together. I think that a lot of law, especially when it comes to disability related topics and advocacy, that it's just not accessible to the average person, that you shouldn't need a law degree in order to understand or feel that you're only doing things because you're afraid of getting sued. That we should be doing these things because they actually benefit everybody. They benefit your bottom line. You might make more money if you're more inclusive. You might have better public opinion. Don't just do it because you're afraid of a lawsuit. That's where I come from.
I love that you explained your journey and that it wasn't traditional in the way that you found what really fulfills you now and what propels your purpose in your career and in your lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And going off of the topic of accommodations and legislation that should be accessible, make things accessible for everybody, what are some legislative changes or accommodations that you feel need to be either established or approved upon to better support people who are autistic and neurodivergent?
I feel like there's a lot of different ways to go with this. So I have a very respected colleague of mine who teaches at Stetson University College of Law. Her name is Robin Powell, and she teaches disability law. And Professor Powell challenges her students every semester to name an area of law that isn't touched by disability or disability law. And every semester they fail because everything is a disability issue or it could be an autism issue or however you want to see it. And I think the things that are really important, at least to me, are workplace policy and also just civil rights policy. So from civil rights, something that I would love to see more widespread is supported decision making as an alternative to guardianship. So this is something that gets me really nerdy and excited. So if you're not familiar with guardianship, I tell people just think about Britney Spears as kind of like your jumping off point, is that it's a process by which like the court can appoint someone to make decisions for you. Usually it could be a parent, it could be a sibling, it could be a trusted relative or adult, or it could just be a professional guardian. And in that, you lose a lot of your rights and that person makes those decisions for you. So they might be able to choose if you work, where you work, what healthcare decisions are made for you, refuse treatment. You might not be able to vote. You might not be able to get married, like all sorts of very different things in that. And it's very difficult to get out of a guardianship. So supported decision making is an alternative that we make decisions with the people that we trust and their help. And I think that's a really great thing to have on the books everywhere. I know Florida, we've been pushing to get it signed into law for at least a year now because I'm part of the coalition for that. But I know some states adopted it much sooner than others. And I would love to see that on a national scale. Something else that I really like to see when it comes to workplace policy is I would love to see the end of subminimum wage. So there's a provision in the Fair Labor Standards Act from the Great Depression era that basically allows certificate holders with the government to pay less than minimum wage to people with disabilities. Most people think of Goodwill when it comes to this, not to throw them under the bus, but that's the first person you think of. And a lot of us actually, you can actually find out who the certificate holders are online because the Department of Labor has to publish that, and they could pay less than whatever federal minimum wage is, which I believe is about $7.25 an hour to people with disabilities. So equal pay for equal work would be very nice to help close those disparities because we know that the autistic and neurodivergent community are historically unemployed or underemployed. And I think also just more support for transition to employment. So more funding for vocational rehab, job coaches, all of these different things, and not having employment also impact benefits for folks who are receiving SSI and SSDI, that they should be able to work without losing benefits and crucial medical care if they need it.
Exactly. Oh, I love that you're talking about all of this. And something that I think also gets lost in this conversation too is retainment of these individuals in their job and the ability for them to move higher in the workplace. Like those things are very challenging as well for people who are either on the spectrum or who have a disability, and there should be more support for them in those situations as well. But I think the root of all change is really self-advocacy, and you talked a little bit about it and how it influenced your career, and that you were educating your peers and your colleagues from the very beginning. So could you share a little bit more on how you were self-advocating and why it's important to do in the workplace and how that's shaped your career?
Absolutely. So self-advocacy is kind of a journey and it looks different for everyone. I think it's actually the one thing when we talk about schools and students that I wish more teachers and professionals put a focus on, because so often when we think about advocacy, we think about that parents will do it for their children, not with their children. So I think that even just making decisions at home, like asking someone what they want to eat or something like that, and actually empowering them to make that decision and honoring that. So it's seen that like, okay, we can actually make these little changes in our lives. That self-advocacy ultimately is being able to make decisions and be in control of your own life. And that's also why I feel the way I do about guardianship, is you lose so much of that. And I think for, at least in the workplace, that self-advocacy looks very different, whether it's a disclosure conversation, you're getting accommodations, or you don't want to disclose, but you still want help in some way, shape, or form. Like if you're one of those people that wants not an accommodation, but you want someone to know like how you work best, and you know that they could do something to help you with that, but you don't want to disclose. Like even just filling in the blanks on assertive statements, like I work best when ... I work best when you give me clear instructions. It sets kind of that tone of self-advocacy of saying, this is how you can support me. This is how I can support you and do the best that I can. So I think self-advocacy looks very different in situations and depending on the person. But I really think that for me, it's the thing that being self-aware is the only reason that I was able to really be an effective self-advocate, is I knew my strengths and weaknesses very early on. I knew that even in going to college, I knew that I didn't want to go out of state because I didn't think I can handle it. I never flew alone before. That was something that I was afraid of, and I just didn't want to deal with it. And I never did. And I knew that was one of my limits. As much as my college counselor wanted me to go to some very fancy liberal arts school in the Northeast, I knew I was staying in Florida. And sometimes it's setting those boundaries, it's setting boundaries and also knowing yourself.
Yes. And I feel that perhaps sometimes it's so hard for people to disclose their disability outwardly and openly because they fear the stigma that surrounds it, which should not be the case anymore. But because of the stigma that still exists, a lot of times people are doubted or questioned about their potential solely based on their disability or their autism. So if this was an experience for you, could you talk us through what that was like in your journey to becoming a successful lawyer, author, and advocate, and how you built upon your resiliency during these trials and tribulations to help push you forward in your career goals?
I feel like disclosure is always kind of a mess for many different reasons because it's so situational. So I always like to explain this as the way that I would have that initial conversation with someone that I work for or I'm interviewing with is very different than the way I would have it with you, and is very different than the way I'd have it with somebody I'm dating and somebody I'm friends with and some random person that just wants to know more. That it's a very situational thing. So that's something I always like to kind of bring into focus when we talk about this, but people do doubt you or they do treat you differently, especially when you do first disclose. People don't immediately default to like, how can I make you more comfortable, or thanks for sharing that. The first gut reaction people have is, I would never know if you didn't tell me. I'm so sorry that, oh my God, that's so inspiring. And it's like, that's not what you're going for. You're usually sharing this information for a very specific purpose. At least for me, it's I either want you to know me better, I want to be vulnerable with you, I need help, that there's many, or I just want to be understood and I want to be able to show up as my full self. There's so many reasons to have those conversations. And it really sucks when people assume that it means you're a tech genius, or it means that you can only do certain things, or they start talking down to me. Is I think oftentimes, and I notice this in legal, is when I would disclose, people suddenly would talk down to me, or they would think I was less capable. So I had to prove that I was competent when other people had the presumption of competence already there when they walked in the room. And it isn't, I agree that it's unfair, that the stigma is very real. And I think having to work extra hard to get half as far by proving that stigma shouldn't exist is very difficult, no matter what profession you're in. But I also know that legal is especially hard on people with disabilities, especially with bar admissions, and that you might have to disclose, especially for mental health and other reasons, and that they can try to say that you're not unfit to practice. And that when you're applying to admission for the bar, there's all sorts of things that you might not think about that are very real obstacles for people with disabilities looking to enter certain professional fields as well. It's just hard. And the other thing that I have when I disclose with lawyers is a lot of lawyers I work with are older. So they have children on the spectrum, or they have adult children who are my age, and they're not sure what box to place me in. They don't know if I'm like their kid or if I'm one of their colleagues. They just don't know where I belong in that mix. And they don't quite realize I could be both at the same time. That we like as humans to put people in boxes. We like to label things. We stereotype naturally because it saves us time and it's familiar, not because we're trying to hurt people. And oftentimes that stereotype of what box does this person belong in ends up hurting me, because I often get placed in the kid box. I don't get placed in the equal colleague who just happens to be 20 years younger box.
You mentioned so many great points that can just diverge into so many different conversations that are all equally important. But most importantly, I think it's great that you are authentic to yourself throughout all of these challenges and throughout this process that you are going through in your career, because either people are going to accept you for who you are or they're not. And that's nothing to do with you. It's just based off of their own personal biases. But it's unfortunate that you have to prove yourself, but in a way that provides an opportunity for them to learn as well, and to shape their minds about what they might have previously thought, and kind of reflect and say, oh, you know what? She actually is really capable of doing all these things, and I was in the wrong. And hopefully, I think with more representation, once you become the CEO of companies and we have more representation of disabilities as leaders, I think those gaps will become further and further, closer and closer between. But to kind of change,
I have so many feelings on that.
Really, you can go ahead.
Because there's so much, like, I think that, like, of course we need more CEOs and stuff, and like we say this and I'm like, yeah, and then we have to also have those people that are in power now dismantle those barriers for us to even get there in the first place. A lot of workplaces think just giving us a job is good enough, and that's where the buck stops, because we checked off a box in diversity and inclusion. Not that autistic and disabled people actually want careers. We want mentorship, we want support. And I know in my career, it's been very difficult to find good mentors. Like, a lot of people find someone right away. I feel like I always struggled with that, because people always saw like, you hit the checkbox, you hit the token checkbox. And I had to feel like, no. And it's so much extra labor that's unexpected and not always wanted on my part, to have to constantly be educating people, especially when I'm there to do something else. If I'm there to do legal research or to argue emotion, I'm not there to be Autism 101. So I think it's very frustrating that a lot of additional labor does fall on marginalized people in the workplace. That, I don't mean this as a false equivalency or anything, but I think that if you are marginalized and junior in an organization, so to speak, so you're one of the younger folk, you're one of the new people, and if you are like disabled, if you are a Black, Indigenous person of color, if you are a woman, if you are a member of the LGBTQ plus community, if you are marginalized in some way, you are having to explain that. You are having to be the educational person in the room, even if you don't want to be. And it's labor that is additional labor that is tacked onto your job that isn't always wanted. I mean, like, I'm always happy to do it. I'm always happy to educate people because I want people to do better. But sometimes it takes a toll. So I feel like that's something that needs to get explained. Like, it sounds very good on paper to be like, yeah, of course we're all going to move up in this place, but it's like, look how much extra work has to get there, because we have to teach people constantly when it shouldn't always be part of our job.
And I think that just scratches the surface on how important allyship is.
Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
was thinking that.
Getting so many more people invested in building communities and careers for people who are disabled or from marginalized groups of people, so that everyone's involved in this process, because who knows the positive repercussions that could happen because these people have mentors from the beginning, so that they can grow in their careers and become even more successful and bring more value to the entire industry as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And that's why we love having different perspectives on our series too, because these are conversations that need to be had and aren't always had because some people are afraid to express their opinion. But that's why we love that you are so open and willing to share with us. But talking about how some might feel comfortable in the workplace because they might feel pressure to suppress some of their traits and characteristics, whether they have autism or maybe a different disability.
Mm-hmm.
What advice would you share for them so that they can express themselves more freely or be more authentic to themselves?
First off, if you're masking or any of that at work, I am not going to shame you for it because it is completely valid when the world is telling you to be open, but not to the extent that they're comfortable with. So I feel like there's a lot of messaging that goes on when we talk about autistic people that we're often told, be yourself, but not like that. And that reinforces why people mask. So I think you're asking like, why, how can we tell people to unmask at the same time? And I understand that a lot of us mask for different reasons, especially people who are multiply marginalized. So I know like autistic women and autistic people of color, it's often a survival tactic that you're trying to prevent an assault or violence or in police encounter, for instance, because you don't want to appear suspicious or you don't want to seem vulnerable in some way. So I think it's really understanding that a lot of it does come from survival rather than trying to be socially accepted is something that we don't do a very great job addressing. So if that's something that you're doing out of fear or survival, that's so valid. And don't share more than you're uncomfortable with and you're comfortable with, sorry. And every workplace is different. So some places might be safer for you to be bring your full self while others aren't. So I think that no matter what decision you make, it's valid and it's on your time. Again, if you don't feel comfortable disclosing to more than just a direct supervisor or you're self-accommodating the entire time, that's so valid and that's your decision. But if you don't feel comfortable in your own skin outside of work, that's a whole different issue and how you are with just yourself rather than that you might not share things with certain colleagues or something like that. So I was like that too, is the way that I would disclose to the other lawyers I worked with was very different. And how much information I'd share was very different with them than what I would with a direct supervisor. Cause I just didn't, and I would have to be forced to share with my colleagues because they thought I was receiving special treatment or that I was the favorite. And I had to explain certain things to them that I didn't always feel comfortable with and I don't always know how they saw me. I mean, everyone was always very nice to me, and I'm very grateful for that. That I did work with some very wonderful people, but it was things that I didn't prepare for. And I think that a lot of us, you have to realize that these decisions do have repercussions, and that they're not as simple as just telling someone or just being 100% yourself. Sometimes you're telling someone because you're working on a project together and your brain just doesn't executive function properly. That happens to me all the time is that sometimes I will miss something important, or I can't prioritize and I'm scatterbrained all the time. But I think telling people or having those conversations and unmasking is something that it starts with self-acceptance and go from there. But I think in certain it is also situational. So if you feel that you can't, that doesn't make you less autistic. It doesn't make you less of a person or make you unworthy of that acceptance and inclusion and support.
So this might be a loaded follow-up question, but in terms of employers themselves or colleagues that work with autistic individuals, how can they what advice would you give them to be more inclusive, understanding, accepting, and open-minded so that the pressure isn't on for people to mask?
So I think a lot of inclusion practices are things that benefit everybody. That's kind of how I see it, is you're not just trying to help the non-disclosing autistic or disabled person in the room. You end up helping everyone. So if we have options to work from home, for instance, that could benefit anyone. It might benefit you if you have kids that need more time from a parent to be home, or you can't afford the cost of childcare. But meanwhile, work from home is a necessity for a lot of people with disabilities for a variety of different reasons, whether it's access to care or being in our own environments and not having to deal with like fluorescent lighting and office chatter or whatever it might be. So I think that implementing a lot of inclusion policies at the forefront, regardless, is actually a really great signal. When it comes to job descriptions, even making sure that you aren't just putting arbitrary screen out type requirements. So a lot of jobs that don't require manual labor will have like, you have to be able to lift 50 pounds. That's how you're going to self-select out people with disabilities in a legal way. And I think about this a lot, even with like nonprofit boards, and how individuals will be self-selected, or that you won't get that diverse, like it won't, like the diversity is not reflected in the organization. Is sometimes if there's like a give or get to serve on a board, or you have to donate this much money, or you have to be able to get people to donate this much on your behalf, like you're going to screen out a huge chunk of people. So I think we have to look at how can we make everything approachable from the bottom up and the top down. So, but I think in practice, if you know that you have employees who are neurodiverse, if you have people that you want to bring in, even just making it clear that you're there. And if somebody discloses to you, this is the question that I always wish people ask more, because oftentimes we teach self-advocates how to have those conversations. We don't teach the neurotypicals on the other end how to react properly, or how they can be more supportive if somebody discloses. If someone says to you, I'm autistic, what do you do? And instead, we're preparing the other person to tell someone that they're autistic, but we're not telling the other person what to do or how they should act. So the script always seems kind of off no matter what. And when I have to talk to the neurotypical people about how to react, is even just, what can I do to make you more comfortable? Or thank you for sharing that with me, not just jumping to the, oh my God, I never would have known if you didn't tell me script. Like, that doesn't help me. It doesn't help you. It's even just asking, like, what can I do? Or even just, I take this a lot from the LGBTQ community as well, as asking who knows. Who else knows that you're autistic? Because not everyone discloses to the whole world. Not everybody is ready to come out to all of their colleagues or all of their friends, for instance. It's like, you want to also protect that person's safety and that in their trust. So even just asking who else knows, or could you share this information, I think is a really powerful follow-up at times. So I think even just being ready for those conversations, learning more, and also just, again, taking the time to listen to the neurodivergent and autistic and disabled people who are already working for you, because 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. Whether or not you know it, you more than likely know someone or are working with someone who does. They just might not disclose for whatever the reason. And there are a lot of very valid reasons not to disclose anything.
Exactly. And I feel like it's even an opportunity for the neurotypical community to lead by example as well, and disclose sometimes when things are uncomfortable for them, and to just be more vulnerable in the workplace and not be afraid to share those things, so that those who are really struggling can feel comfortable to share their perspectives as well.
Absolutely. And something I always tell neurotypicals too is, like, if you share something very vulnerable about yourself, sometimes it really just makes people feel comfortable sharing something about them. Is that putting that pressure on like an employee, not the employer, when they're sharing vulnerable things? Like, I remember the first time I taught a college class, and I was very open with my students, and I had students who never received accommodations in my class, maybe because they didn't have a formal diagnosis, maybe they just didn't need extra time or whatever the university was offering. And they were very honest with me, both in class and with others, about their journeys with disability, that if it was them. And I realized they had that connection. And I know that happens a lot when people are open and vulnerable. Even when I know I had seen supervisors that are open about if their kids are LGBTQ, or they're open about their own struggles with mental health or addiction or whatever it might be, it kind of opens the gate for other people to feel comfortable. Like, this person is safe. They've experienced hardship before. They know what it's like to be different. So I think that's something that neurotypicals can do all the time. And I know that neurotypicals are told, like, if you share a story about yourself, it usually is seen as that you're not listening. And at the same time, in neurodivergent, it's like, I share a story because that's how I can relate to you. And I think that we take those struggles as a signal that we can relate and share our story too.
Right. And that's a way we can build empathy for one another. I feel like over the past couple of years with the pandemic, we've learned a little bit more about that, and just gaining that skill of empathy a little bit more, but there's so much more work to be done.
Oh, for sure. Empathy is a skill set for everyone. And the thing is that autistic people and neurotypical people both don't understand each other and how they show empathy.
Right.
That we don't understand you and you don't understand us. And everyone thinks it's just that you don't understand us, but it turns out it's both ways. That it's a two-way street there. It's the double empathy problem.
Exactly. Well, our series reaches a broad audience between parents, professionals, self-advocates. And as we're wrapping up, what is something that you would like to share with our viewers so that they can take a message, if one, there are many that we talked about, regarding neurodiversity or the autism community that they can use every day in their lives?
So I know that we talked about a lot today, and I know that sometimes it might be kind of uncomfortable to hear things you don't know about for the first time or something like that. And I want you to know it's okay. It's okay if you feel a little uncomfortable, because we can work through this together. That acceptance and is part of a bigger journey. So I always like to think of it is that we have this 4-step process kind of going on. Is that you have this awareness component that you know that autism and neurodiversity and things exist. You have understanding, which is listening to the neurodivergent people in your life or getting to understand other people that you're around. And then you have acceptance, which is actually appreciating and respecting and accepting these differences are real. And then we have action, which is something that you could do that in your everyday life or the people around you or the groups that you're in to help impact other people. So I hope that you feel compelled and inspired to take action, that maybe there's something you could do to be more inclusive of the neurodivergent people in your life or the community at large. So allyship is something that we talked about a lot. And I think that having allies is the most powerful thing we can do. And I don't think we have enough of them. So, and there's always something that you could do that you could walk away with thinking, I can do better at this. I can do something. And I hope that you walk away with something that is usable and that we are able to do a better job understanding each other and being more accepting overall.
Those are all fantastic points. Thank you for sharing that and inspiring our audience to invest in all different ways so that we can cultivate a community of inclusion as well. So as we're finishing up, thank you so much for being with us. Is there anything that you're working on right now that you want to share with our audience that they can look forward to in your work? Or I know that you have a podcast out there, so anything that you want to share about right now for them to look for?
Absolutely. So if you want to follow along and learn some more stuff, I do co-host a podcast every couple weeks, depending on scheduling, it seems like. That is by and for women on the autism spectrum. So it's really cool. We interview a lot of really awesome women in the neurodivergent and autistic community. Oftentimes, I make a point of making sure our guests are autistic self-advocates or that they're very adjacent and have something very powerful to add to that conversation. The more exciting things is I spent lockdown writing, and now I have 2 books coming out to show for it. So I have Great Minds Think Differently, Neurodiversity for Lawyers and Other Professionals coming this summer. And I have the Young Autistic Adults Independence Handbook coming in the fall. So that's November-ish, I believe. And I'm really excited because I love getting to write about issues pertaining to the workplace, inclusion, and also young adults, because figuring out what you want to do when you grow up and how to do adult things like manage your money and like date and do anything that seems kind of adult seems very scary. And young autistic people don't often get told how to do those things or get those skills. And oftentimes I'm still learning them. And I'm pretty sure there's still laundry that I haven't moved into the dryer yet, but that's okay. I'll forgive myself for it later. But yeah, I'm always up to something. And I encourage you to follow along and keep this conversation moving.
Great. And we really, like I said earlier, we really appreciate having you on our series, Haley. And so if anyone enjoyed this episode and would like to learn more about Haley, please visit her website at haleymoss.net. Also, you can find her on Instagram and Twitter at HaleyMossArt, Facebook at www.facebook.com/HaleyMossArt, and LinkedIn, Haley Moss ESQ. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next Sunday. Thank you for listening to Spectrum Sundays. We are your hosts, Miss Thousand Islands, Francesca D'Alessandro,
and Miss Central Pennsylvania, Megan Sinisi. Please make sure to subscribe to our series and follow us on social media to stay connected with autism professionals and self-advocates.
And remember, true impact is accomplished through active listening and exploring the world through a variety of perspectives.
Join us next week on Spectrum Sundays to help cultivate a community of inclusion, appreciation, and acceptance around autism.
you.